I am joined here today by Dr. Chandra Sripada. He is a professor at the University of Michigan, holding a joint appointment in both philosophy and psychiatry. Chandra's research concerns questions about agency, decision, and self-control, as well as cognitive control. We'll discuss more of those distinctions in a little bit. His work integrates philosophical theorizing with results drawn from empirical disciplines, especially psychology, neuroscience, and psychiatry. Recent papers that we hope to delve into explore cognitive control, self-control, addiction, free will, and the stream of consciousness. That's quite a range. So, Chandra, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, Andy. Thanks for having me.
Yes, we appreciate that very much. And to begin with, going through just a summary of the range of different topics that you're investigating, the combination of psychiatry and philosophy, it's not very common in my experience. So just to start out with, how did you arrive at this job with that combination of disciplines?
Yeah, good question. I asked it myself that as well. My path through school was not planned. It involved herky-jerky, go this way, go that way. It involved a lot of not knowing what pathway to go. And, to fill in a little bit, as an undergrad, I was a honors program major at University of Texas at Austin. It's called Plan 2, and you do a lot of philosophy. And I love philosophy. It just never occurred to me that you could study it. I had no idea you could go to graduate school and study that. I was always interested in the mind. I ended up heading towards medical school, psychiatry, neuroscience research, but I loved philosophy. So I ended up going to philosophy grad school and combining all of it. And like I said, it was herky-jerky, but it worked out. I'm in a happy place now at the end of that.
It does seem, in many ways, to be a natural confluence because we talk so much about what is the mind exactly, how does the brain interface with the mind, and especially these days with so much research now about artificial intelligence, for example.
Yeah.
So all of those, especially with neuroscience and neuroimaging, it seems to be a natural combination of all of those.
It definitely is. Anybody who studies the mind-brain quickly recognizes that disciplinary boundaries are largely meaningless. And that means that if you're in a department of psychology, you could be doing neuroscience, you could do computational things, your collaborators may be in statistics or electrical engineering. I will say one thing that philosophy gives you that is distinctive is there are no rules, essentially. It's boundless in philosophy. You can invoke levels of abstraction and open-endedness that are not typical of the natural sciences. So bringing philosophy into the mix is a good thing as well.
Yeah, I suppose everybody who's studying the brain needs some kind of philosophy about what exactly they're studying, like the phenomenon of what they're studying.
Absolutely.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and some people are perfectly well aware of it as they're studying this material. They recognize how freaky and weird the whole enterprise is, and what you're studying is deeply fascinating and requires some philosophical help.
Mm-hmm. So related to that, just getting into some of the details about your research, how does philosophy inform your work in psychiatry and neuroimaging, and vice versa from the other side?
Yeah, great. I mean, it's easier to say from the other side.
Okay.
So I'm the type of philosopher, and by no means unique, who does empirically informed philosophy. This is a very well-established sub-area in philosophy, and it's respected. It is well-entrenched, and so this type of philosophy asks interesting questions about nature of mind, consciousness, decision, free will, moral responsibility, and does so in close association with the sciences. The sciences give you plenty of material to constrain theorizing and bring in new ideas and things like that. Mm-hmm. So that direction, it's perfectly natural. The other direction I, you know, I, it's hard to put your finger on it, but philosophical work gives you a perspective, a level of abstraction, and a kind of rigor in argumentation that helps you do science. And many scientists have it naturally, and maybe they don't need to go to philosophy and bodybuild on some of these skills. But it doesn't hurt to be exposed to the rigor and clarity of philosophy. It definitely finds its way into science, especially in the frontier areas of science. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can't say I have a strong background in philosophy. I know probably as much as the average person, but something that really does stick with me is in virtually every other aspect of our lives, we do appreciate good reasons for why certain things are done. It could be your daily routine, it could be government policy, and why not apply some same reason principles to how we understand, how we perceive the world, how the mind works, and so on. But yeah, coming from my background, which is more from neuroimaging, I think we do have certain assumptions, but they may not be very explicit about, again, just how the mind works, how certain experiments work. The assumptions of pure insertion, where you insert maybe one condition and you assume, in some cases, it doesn't affect everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's just one example where philosophers have studied the issues and using their kind of unique methods and their clarity of argumentation have shed light on the debate. And there are many, many, many others. I mean, who amongst us as a scientist hasn't looked at a computational or mechanistic theory of, let's say, a phenomenon like decision and started to worry about questions like free will and mechanical explanation of behavior and found themselves getting tripped up between competing views of looking at the area or that kind of problem? So there are just so many points of interlinkage between philosophy and the sciences and so many ways of moving back and forth from one to the other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, let's start talking about some of the phenomena of decision making, because that's been a huge part of the psychological literature for a long time.
Yeah.
And especially recently with neuroimaging, we focus on certain regions like the anterior cingulate is always something that comes up as responsive to or associated with, which seems to be kind of a loose term. Right. But whenever somebody seems to be making an effortful decision or they have to switch between different sets of rules, for example, to act appropriately, that area of the brain seems to show activation as indexed by fMRI. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about your investigation into that using neuroimaging and decision-making? How would you like to start talking about your research in that area?
Yeah, so I do use neuroimaging as one very important methodology, but I also do kind of computational modeling of behavioral data and things like that.
Yes.
You asked directly about decision and neuroimaging. When I was a resident, my very first psychiatry resident neuroimaging paper was doing a delayed discounting task in the scanner. And 20 subjects. That sounds ridiculous looking back. 20 subjects.
The good old days.
The good old days, exactly. Yeah. And we found activation in medial prefrontal cortex, and we found, striatum. And, you kind of, the game then was, you show these things light up, and then you draw some speculations about what these activations mean, and then that's your paper. Neuroimaging can be deeply illuminating for many kinds of questions, but this is where, maybe the computational models that didn't use neuroimaging often have a lot to say and shed a lot of insight. Now, it's a huge topic, but I'll tell you a couple of avenues of computational modeling that I think are revealing of how we should think about decision. One is the evidence accumulation models of in speeded decisions. This is a class of models, and then this is you may be familiar with these, Andy, but your audience may not. So I'll just say a little bit about it.
Of course.
The phenomenon being captured is somebody is in front of a computer screen and stimuli are being shown, and it could be like a perceptual decision. Maybe you're classifying some lines that show up on the screen. You're classifying whether they're oriented leftwards or oriented rightwards. Or maybe you're presented with choice stimuli. Would you like this amount of money now? Would you like this amount of money later? Or it could be decisions involving any sort of thing. What seems to be happening is that there are systems in the mind brain which are collecting evidence, and we'll just focus on the two-choice case, with respect to the options, and they're gathering noisy evidence rapidly. So the timescale is here around 500 milliseconds to 1 second.
Okay.
And when sufficient evidence for that decision maker, based on their own kind of subjective criterion of how much evidence is enough, sufficient evidence gathers for one of the options, that is the mechanistic underpinning of the person making a choice in favor of that option. They choose, oh, the lines are oriented that way. Or I would rather have $10 now than $11 in a month. Or whatever the decision involved.
Mm-hmm.
That is a model of a moment of choice. And these models are extremely detailed and well confirmed with respect to behavior, accuracy, reaction time, and so forth. That's beautiful to me. Choice is the fundamental constituent of a philosophical topic, agency.
Yeah.
And we've got a model of exactly how choice unfolds and this deeply mysterious phenomenon that we might want to relegate to a soul stuff making the choice. No. It's a computational process where evidence is arising, hitting a decision threshold, and you're making that choice. That's a very simple operation. But it's not hard to see how concatenating lots of these moments of choice, these small, basic decisions, you can get the complexity of an agent doing all sorts of things like driving to the grocery store or forming an intention to do this and several weeks later completing that intention. You can get a lot more complexity out of it. But that style of modeling has been deeply kind of influential in how I think about this whole domain of decision.
That's fascinating. Is it fair to call those drift diffusion models? Is that a class of it, right?
That's
okay.
Yeah, exactly. Some people view that as almost synonymous because that's the most famous instance of this kind of evidence accumulation model.
Okay, right, yes. Yeah, and I know we've all had that subjective feeling where you may feel torn between two decisions and you can start to feel some momentum emotionally kind of building up towards one of them, and that kind of tilts you over a certain edge.
Yeah, when the evidence is roughly aligned, this process slows down. It takes longer to accumulate evidence for the boundary. And then some of this phenomenon becomes introspectable. Mm-hmm. And you can, just as you described, you can see or introspect and see this kind of process unfolding. But most of the time, these are very rapid decisions that unfold under conscious awareness. And the consequences of the decision we're consciously aware of. For example, my decision to raise my hand as a demonstration.
Right.
But for the most part, these moments of choice are unfolding ubiquitously in our cognitive lives. Mm-hmm. That at least is how I think about decision and link it to the more dynamic, temporally extended process of agency.
Yes. Yeah, I'm aware that there's obviously been a lot of research in this area behaviorally, also with neuroimaging, trying to find some kind of substratum that might be indicating, what direction a person is intending to make a choice in. Right. It could be a political decision. It could be deciding what to eat for breakfast. It could be deciding whether to pursue or end a relationship. I mean, any of those. Yeah, it does seem to. Usually, it's constrained to be like in a two-choice format. Yeah. This or this. Now, there are cases where it might be more complex than that. And if you have multiple potential options, how would somebody visualize that? How does the modeling look in that more complex multidimensional space, so to speak?
Yeah, it turns out that these models, there's a variety of ways of going from the two-option case to the multi-option case. Mm-hmm. And, and here you start to get into the weeds. If your initial choice is to represent the relative evidence that supports, in the two-option case, one option over the other, it becomes much more difficult to see how you scale that up to 10 options. But if you use what's called the racing accumulator approach, where each of the options has its own kind of runner that is collecting evidence for that option. So you're not exclusively modeling the relative evidence in the two-option case, but you have each option having its own decision variable. The scaling up process is still non-trivial, but is rendered easier, suggesting that the two-option case relative evidence is a special case of the more general racing type model.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's make this now a more concrete example in which you have studied different kinds of mental conditions, mental illnesses, things like post-traumatic stress disorder, and also addiction, which obviously is a major social concern. A lot of people suffer from this. And in that case, when somebody has these choices and there's certain good aspects associated with, say, taking a drug, but also they know that there are negative consequences. In that case, how is that different in that scenario? If anything is categorically different, or how does your research inform those kinds of decisions?
Good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So getting this picture on the table that choice, that agency arises from these basic decision processes, and they're ubiquitous, and each one is an evidence accumulation process. That's a good starting place for thinking about agency. And, free agency may be the case in which the individual has goals and aims, and these individual decision processes, they have a tough job. They have to represent the evidence that favors one option or another, and in the multiple case, lots of different options. They have to do that very rapidly for all the different kinds of decisions that we're making. They do it in real time. They typically do a really good job. They're relatively, and here's the term that may jolt some people. They're relatively accurate. The decision variables accurately represent the evidence that favors this or that option with respect to the person's more basic goals and aims. And that may be a kind of ideal that we want these decision processes that they have a tough job, but we want them to be relatively accurate most of the time. And you asked a great question. What happens in a case like addiction? And I think we can contrast two pictures. And the first one may be the more familiar, and that's the compulsion picture. Mm-hmm. And there's a philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, that has such a beautiful and vivid description of what this might look like. He talks about an unwilling addict who hates his addiction, and he feels these overpowering urges to use the drug. And, he knows that this addiction is bad for him and hates it, but each time he feels that urge, he rails against it. But each time, and this is Frankfurt's language, he's defeated. He is conquered by his own desires. That's the compulsion picture. And that may be the ordinary picture of what happens in addiction. But there's lots of empirical evidence that that's not the way that addiction actually works.
Really?
I'll give you, and I will return to what addiction looks like in my picture, but I want to say a couple, just so the audience maybe has a feel for what this evidence looks like. Here's one. There are so many scales out there to measure the strength of cravings. And they're used very, very widely in addiction research. And you can look up the data of where did subjects who have addiction, cocaine, opium, cigarettes, alcohol, how strongly are they rating their cravings? Very rare for them to rate those cravings as stronger than the midpoint of those scales, often well below. You say, well, how do they have a problem if the level of the craving is not that strong? That's a real puzzle.
Yeah.
Here's another one. These studies are relatively rare, but Marlott, George Marlott, who is the founder of the CBT School of Addiction Treatment, and colleagues did a study of people who had relapsed after they had given up alcohol, opiates, and other drugs, and retrospectively asked them, what was going on when you relapsed? You were sober for a while. Why did you relapse? Emotional issues, stress, those kind of things show up.
Mm-hmm.
Temptation, strength of craving, very rarely rated as a cause of the relapse. And so there's lots of evidence like this, that the strength of the craving isn't the driving factor we should be looking at. So what is it? And there, go back to this decisional picture where, you're an agent, you're perceiving things in the environment, you're making decisions about what to do. I'll go back to cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a foundational school in psychotherapy, has a picture of how the mind works that says, at least in some individuals, there are all sorts of distortions that operate. And a canonical distortion is negativity bias.
Mm-hmm.
You look at me with a fairly neutral expression. I can interpret that as you're curious. I can interpret that as you're frowning and you don't want to discuss this. Negativity bias is a characteristic tendency of the mind during these decisional moments to arrive at a kind of a negative interpretation of events, negative orientation of attention, negative responses to most social situations. Minds that are biased towards negativity, towards threat, towards various kinds of things will construct a world, and it's very hard for the person to recognize that there are aspects of the world that they are seeing and ways that they react to the world that are, I'll use that term again, inaccurate. They're negativity biased, they're threat biased, there are various kinds of biases that operate in these rapid decisions. If you're an individual that has a world that has that kind of subjective interpretation to you, it can seem rational, especially under conditions of stress, to cope with that kind of situation with alcohol, opiates, and other substances. Notice Harry Frankfurt's overwhelming desire or compulsion doesn't enter into this explanation. Huh. What is going on is an individual sees their surroundings as bleak, their future as pessimistic, as their ability to cope as limited. They see the attraction of the drug as hypertrophied. Mm-hmm. A lot of inaccuracy here, and ordinary processes of choice are enough to get them to use. You don't need to postulate an overwhelming desire.
Okay, wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think we all, at least the layperson, assumes that there, is a compulsion, this kind of overwhelming desire for either the positive benefits of the high or avoiding the negative aspects of the withdrawal. But you're saying it's more they have these inaccurate pictures of what might happen. Yeah. Okay.
The only part that I would concede to the compulsion theorists, though, is it may not be under the person's, I'll use that term control very loosely. When you are experiencing the world inaccurately in a spontaneous way across time and situation, there isn't some higher order you that can stand outside that and correct all that. Mm-hmm. This process of recognizing and criticizing and revising inaccurate, spontaneous impressions, that's challenging. That's work you do with a therapist, if it works at all. Right. So what I concede to the compulsion therapist is there's a sense in which the person is out of control when they use drugs, but not because of an overwhelming desire, because of pervasive inaccuracy.
How do you think changing the perspective of someone's distortion, cognitive distortion or lack thereof, should or could change approaches to helping people deal with substance use disorders, addictions. Also keeping in mind that there's obviously a gradient. Some people are very, very deep into addiction, in which it's so deeply ingrained in their life. There are triggers everywhere, environment, friends, stressors, seemingly every day is blasting at them. Other people can, let's call them functional. I don't know if that's common currency, but they can get through the week. They hold down a job, but they still just have moments which they feel might be out of their control, or they will start to use based on these stressors or something else. And they recognize that they really don't want to do it. They know that it has all these negative consequences for their health, for their relationships. Again, this is very broad, but with this distortion model that you proposed, how do you think, getting back to what I was saying initially, that might change, say, cognitive behavioral therapy or other kinds of interventions?
Yeah, so one thing is, a couple of observations. One is this predicament in which we make ongoing impressions spontaneously, these decision processes operating rapidly and ubiquitously. And those impressions may be systematically off. That's the human predicament, and we all have biases. And sometimes they're negativity focused, sometimes they're threat, sometimes they're positivity focused. A person can have a narcissistic tendency, and there's a catalog of different biases that operate, and they operate in all of us. So this is the human predicament, and turning to different places in philosophy, not so much the philosophy of mind, but Buddhist thinking, Stoic thinking, classical philosophy, medieval thinkers. These are people, they're talking about this, Augustine, they're talking about this human predicament, the way that our minds misconstrue aspects of the world and what we can do. So it's challenging. So I want to point that out.
Of course.
And then, what are the therapeutic ramifications? There's an interesting way in which the picture I've offered to you of what addiction is the right theory that lines up with actual clinical practice.
I see.
There aren't addiction clinicians. They may use the language, and then this is an odd thing. They may talk about irresistible impulses. They may use those kind of terms, that they may talk in a Frankfurtian way. None of their clinical practice makes any sense if that's their view. Their actual view is much like I described. They're trying to address the problem that the people in their practice have various kinds of distortions, especially negativity and threat biases, anxieties and fears, that need to be simultaneously addressed as they're dealing with the addiction. This is already the way that experienced and effective clinical practitioners are using the model that I'm describing.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. And that just might clarify the thinking behind it. And
exactly. Yeah.
That can be valuable.
It is valuable to have the language and the picture articulated. I think even as clinicians may have the picture that I articulated, they may use the other model, the Frankfurtian model, because it emphasizes lack of control. Mm-hmm. And it's an important point that they're trying to make. They don't want to blame the client who's engaged in clinical treatment. And they think that's the only model that can give that kind of reduction in blame. But the model that I've articulated that lines up closer with what their practice actually involves, that also involves a notion of why the individual can't get out of it easily.
Right.
That also, once you clarify that, it's another route to why this individual isn't to blame.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's also worth keeping in mind that everybody really does have biases and distortions to some degree. We see that in things like work by Kahneman and Tversky. People have certain points at which They're usually more inclined to avoid negative outcomes, even if you present them choices that the expected value is identical or maybe even better if you take a little bit more risk in a certain sense. It is interesting how those filters affect just everyday decisions, not just something as extreme as addiction.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Those filters, I like that term. Those filters operate ubiquitously in mental health. Mental health, in a way, is the study of the different kinds of distortions that can operate in the human mind that lead to systematic patterns of inaccuracy that present clinical problems for the individual. That's exactly right. And normal personality is simply a continuum with the kinds of things that we see in the clinic. Those distortions can operate in ordinary individuals, sometimes even to a similar degree. Because it always, the presence of these distortions and the embedding of that individual in whatever milieu, the local situation that they're in, that creates the clinical predicament. And it may be that another person has these very same distortions. It doesn't get them in trouble.
Right.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Moving back to the neuroimaging field for a second, when we talk about things like reward, we usually link that with addiction somehow, right? We talk about craving versus wanting, for example. And we focus a lot on certain so-called reward systems in the brain, of which the nucleus accumbens, for example, is very prominent, kind of at the base of the subgenual anterior cingulate. When you're proposing this distortion model, have you done any neuroimaging work or seen any neuroimaging work looking at how people's perceptions might be linked to their reward system being hyperactivated or hypoactivated or abnormal in some sense?
Good, yeah. So, when an individual experiences, let's say, negativity bias, there are two factors that we can appeal to for kind of explaining what is going on. One is the perturbation that leads them or inclines them to frame the situation in a way that is more negative than what the evidence warrants. Okay. Then there is also, and this is one of my interests, is cognitive control. That is, what other processes help the mind strike a balance between responding rapidly, given one's inclination, and bringing to bear extra kinds of information and scrutiny, especially information arising from one's current goals and more stable orientations and commitments.
Okay.
So I've done relatively less work on the first one. That is, what are the processes that give rise to reward-directed inclinations or negativity bias and so forth? I've done more work on the second one, which is what other ways do we have, other than our immediate inclinations or automatic processing, to bring to bear information to improve the accuracy of decisions? That, in a way, is a good, this is a contested issue, but what is cognitive control? I, along with my colleagues, Alex Weigard and Andrew Heathcote, we have a review that will be coming out in TICS relatively soon that will give our view of what cognitive control is. And I'll contrast two views, like I did Harry Frankfurt, the compulsion view and the distortion view. I'll contrast two views of cognitive control. One is cognitive control is a kind of conflict specific process where an automatic process is getting triggered, and you have the cognitive control process can come in and suppress it. That's not our view. And this gets into the weeds of why that view may encounter some challenges. Our view is one in which cognitive control is a very general capacity to use stable information held in working memory, especially goal-type information, task-type information, to bring to bear information that is goal-relevant into the decision. So it's not what is the difference between the two views? The first view, the conflict-specific view, says cognitive control kicks in like the incongruent condition of a conflict task, like the Stroop task. So you present words like that are semantically state the name of colors. So the word blue, the word yellow, and those words have ink colors. The word blue could be in blue ink, but it could also be in purple ink, or it could be in green ink. The conflict-specific view says, well, word reading is very habitual. When the word blue is presented in green ink, and you have to say green, because the task says state the ink color, cognitive control kicks in only then. But if the word blue is printed in blue, cognitive control plays no role. Our view is cognitive control is a very general capacity to bring to bear goal-relevant information, irrespective of whether there's conflicting information. That picture of cognitive control we defend with a lot of different kinds of experiments. And it's kind of a synthetic view of what you see in the literature. So this type of cognitive control, as I've described, we call it efficiency of evidence accumulation. Cognitive control is identical to this construct of efficiency of evidence accumulation. And we've identified, especially Alex Weigard, my colleague, we've identified lots of really interesting neuroimaging signatures of efficiency of evidence accumulation. And I can say, I can talk more about that. Sure. But you asked, how does neuroimaging, get into this view about how decisions are made, how distortions operate, and, link it all up with addiction and things like that? Well, one of the very important factors is cognitive control is an individual difference variable. Cognitive control is your ability to use goal information to bring to bear goal-relevant information into a decision. That cognitive control is oftentimes there's less cognitive control ability in individuals that are experiencing systematic inaccuracy.
Okay. Yeah, I remember that was in Current Opinion Biology, I believe, with Alex Weigard. Was that one of them? With the evidence accumulation?
Yeah.
There have been a couple publications.
Yeah, one is biological psychiatry.
Biological psychiatry.
Yeah, we had a review in the Open, Biological Psychiatry Open, review talking about efficiency of evidence accumulation as a very general cognitive control construct that operates in ADHD, and our own lab produced a lot of evidence along these lines. Definitely in addiction, and in bipolar, in schizophrenia, very widely across psychiatric disorders. You see efficiency of evidence accumulation, the ability to use goal information to bring goal-relevant information into the decision process. That is reduced in psychiatric disorders.
Okay.
Yeah. It's one of the most reliable. You ask at a certain point, I've been in the field, I've been a professor for 15 years. What are some of your findings? That's one of the big ones. Okay. The central role of EEA and the way that EEA is should be understood as a cognitive control type construct. And that's one of really the very central insights that we've had. And, a newer line of work linking this to neuroimaging, in very large data sets, we can look at activation of the frontoparietal network in tasks, and we can look at how it behaves in easy tasks and hard tasks, and we can quantify certain measures of how the frontoparietal network, what is its level of activation during this task, both in the easy and the hard conditions, very powerfully related to EEA. That's one of the strongest effects that we've seen, with R squareds here around 25%. And so for the audience who's not familiar, that's a whopping effect size in neuroimaging, replicated in multiple large studies, including ABCD, HCP, as well as other samples. Mm-hmm. So EEA as a very general cognitive control construct, and the way that it gets linked with the frontoparietal network specifically, that's a really important set of findings.
Great. Yeah, we'll put some links to those when we upload this to a couple of those papers, because I do know that Alex Weigard, he's also presented during our psychiatry methods meeting, and this is really interesting. Efficiency of evidence accumulation. And another question to follow up on that, I don't know if you've had time to research this yet. I know it's kind of a new vein that you're harvesting, but is that something that can be trained? Can it be improved? Is it something that just some people are better gifted at having that? Is it something that responds to any kind of training? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, and so that's the right question. Mm-hmm. And, in order to address issues like that, it's step by step. First, you need the neural correlates of individual differences in EEA, efficiency of evidence accumulation. That the paper where we published those kinds of results, that only came out, I think, about a year ago. And Alex, with other colleagues, including Katie Page, has established the psychometric properties of that frontoparietal biomarker that we're talking about, and shown that it's measurement invariant across time in ABCD. So we're talking about the very same construct. It's not changing its relationship to EEA over time. You can measure this biomarker over time in ABCD. In other lines of work, we're showing things like sleep perturb the neural signature that is related to EEA. And other groups have very recently shown that methylphenidate, which is Ritalin, does precisely the opposite of what sleep does. In other lines of work, we show that socioeconomic resources are very closely related to this very same kind of pattern that we see with EEA, sleep, and methylphenidate. So there is starting to be a compelling overall story of EEA being shaped multifactorially by some aspects of the social environment, including the socioeconomic resources of the household, some aspects of things like sleep, which increasingly look really pivotal. There are some pharmacological manipulations that play a role in EEA. We've always known that methylphenidate, Ritalin, improves cognition via this route. And you asked about training. That I would defer to our colleague John Janides, who is our expert on training. My understanding is that work shows you can improve performance on a specific task, but the generalization has not been observed. Now, EEA is a very general construct. That's one of the most striking things about it. In Alex and I's and my research, you measure it on this task, it generalizes to that task. We've measured it in task batteries. We get beautiful, coherent latent factors that have good psychometric properties. So EEA is very general. It would be amazing to collaborate with John or others and find ways that we can directly train EEA, which putatively is general, rather than other things that may not have that generality.
I'd love to talk to John about that. I don't know if we have room for a third microphone, but get both of you would be one of my dreams to talk about that at the same time. That would be very informative. Yeah. But definitely I'd like to talk to him about that one-on-one here.
Yeah, it is interesting that throughout our work, Alex and I distinguish EEA. We call it the task general construct because we can pull it out from simple tasks, complex tasks, executive tasks, non-executive tasks across conditions. It's just such a unified construct and contributes to all these different specific tasks. So it is the right kind of thing to look to train.
Yeah, this is obviously very interesting, and I'm looking forward to new developments in that research. I just want to back up a little bit and clarify ABCD for those who might not know what it is the Adolescent Behavioral Cognitive Development Study, which has been going on for a while.
Yep.
Can you just talk
brain
a little
cognition, brain cognitive development study. I'm an ABCD PI, so I should be able to say the acronym correctly.
It's a mouthful, but
that's 10,000. This is the most amazing study ever undertaken. I mean, maybe I'm biased. I should clarify that. Most amazing developmental neuroimaging study ever undertaken. Let me qualify that as if the greatest study ever undertaken. No, it's probably not that. A good way to frame it is, like I said, when I was a resident, I had a study with 20 people. And we now know that very small studies are not going to be the best way to identify really robust mechanisms that contribute to mental disorders. And what NIAAA and NIDA, under the leadership of Nora Volkow and others, did is they created a definitive mega study, 23 sites, 10,000 kids. They enter the study age 9 to 10, and they're followed 6 months with certain measures annually, and then neuroimaging every 2 years. It continues all the way till they're 21. Maybe there'll be another round of funding, and it will continue thereafter. So this has been a study where my group has, we've seen some really amazing things, like, for example, the EEA link to frontoparietal network and socioeconomic resources effects throughout the brain, the effects of sleep, and so on. But there have been a lot of challenges in ABCD where some of the things that we wanted to find, we did not find, despite having the definitive data set.
Like what?
Many ABCD kids have anxiety. It's one of the most common conditions that's present in these kids. Mm-hmm. We can't find neural signatures of it.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
And, I forget the exact number, but it's going to be more than 1,000 have meaningful levels of anxiety, which means the usable imaging data set may be 6,000 to 8,000, which means we have about 7,000 controls and 1,000 cases. That should be adequate power to see, anxiety circuits, the way they manifest in tasks and things like that. Those effects have been very, very small and disappointing. And so these are some of the things we see in ABCD. We see big signatures for some things, and other things look really eerily silent.
It's strange. Why do you think that is? Any guesses? I mean, there's always some things that can't really be explained that well, but
a useful kind of shortcut for thinking about what's going to work well in ABCD and what won't is a little bit when I talked earlier about at these, I'll go back to those decisional moments, these decision processes. There's going to be some automatic processes that typically constitute the distortion, a negativity bias that operates, a threat bias, or some other kind of automatic influence. And I also said there's cognitive control that operates at these decisional moments. That's going to be your ability to keep the ability to use information, especially goal information in working memory, and bring that to bear to focus on goal-relevant information. The cognitive control has vivid, big, and widespread neural signatures. For example, EEA, and we can get it in a lot of different ways. Mm. That automatic process, for some reason, doesn't have vivid and strong neural signatures. Maybe it's too localized. Maybe it operates in a way that doesn't pump up the bold signal in the way that we need to visualize it, and so forth. But if your hypothesis is something operates at the level of that automatic process, it's hard to find it. But if it operates more at the level of the top-down cognitive process, we can find it. It's a kind of a heuristic that we see in ABCD, with many exceptions, but a useful general kind of statement.
Well, best of luck to you with that. I'm really looking forward to it. The ABCD, along with other multi-site consortia study, really seems to be one of the major trends in the field, leveraging these really large sample sizes over many, many years.
Absolutely. And, thinking back to that initial study with 20 subjects, you can see how limited it is and how, were I to not find anything, I would probably shelve that and move on to something else.
Mm-hmm.
But if every scientist does that, the file drawer effect, you can see sociologically science is going to have a lot of spurious findings. So it's not the right way to conduct neuroimaging research, in my view, especially for these subtle and hard-to-detect constructs like we find in psychiatry. So a better way is these consortium studies. And I will add that another reason the consortium studies are effective is the traditional view was that we're going to see a lot of interesting constructs localized in neural regions. And this gets to the issue of multivariate analysis. I'm an advocate for multivariate analysis. What I see in neuroimaging, for the constructs especially that interest me, things like cognitive control or the effects of socioeconomics or sleep, or you can go on and on. What we find is small effects distributed throughout the brain. And those small effects, if you can aggregate them, which is exactly what a multivariate analysis does, you can get very substantial associations with your construct. But a locationist analysis that goes in with a priori hypotheses that you're going to find the effect over here is going to find a very small effect there. So I'm an advocate of multivariate analyses, these kinds of analyses, though, because the signal is distributed. It's my belief now that most signals of interest are distributed. But to find them and run these multivariate analyses, you need a lot of subjects. You can't use 20. You're going to use highly parameterized models, and those models need a lot of subjects. In order to trust the results, you're going to have to train on a subsample and witness it generalized to unseen subjects. All that is going to require data sets on the order of 1,000 or more. And so that's why consortium studies are just pivotal.
Well, Chandra, I feel like we've just scratched the surface. Obviously, I'd love to talk more about this at a future date. Unfortunately, we are out of time.
Are we really?
Yeah, it's already been an hour.
All right. Okay.
They're going to kick us out soon. But this is great. Thank you for being the first one to agree to be in this environment. I hope that we can do this again, obviously, see how things develop, see what kinds of new results you get from this line of research, and just
absolutely
talk about just everything, basically.
Right. We didn't even talk about AI yet, but
I know,
that's okay.
But
Andy,
that's a whole
thank you. Yeah, that's a whole nother. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, and it was a good chance for me to reflect on some of the things that have that I've experienced in the last 5 to 10 years as a professor and a scientist. So I really thank you very much for the opportunity.
Feeling is mutual. Yeah, anytime.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.